Today we're going to be talking about the different properties of real numbers. Yesterday we talked about the distributive property, um, and these are just some other properties that will help you while you are computing your equations and expressions and things like that. All right, so the first one we have are the commutative properties. We have the commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication. The commutative properties basically tell us that we are going to add in any order or multiply in any order. So for example, 3 plus 7 is the same as 7 plus 3. All right. Um, Same as when you multiply in any order. So 3 times 7 would be the same as 7 times 3. Okay? It doesn't change the answer. In this case, 3 plus 7 would be 10, and 7 plus 3 would be 10, so they are still equal to each other. Same down here, 3 times 7 is 21, 7 times 3 is 21, so they are still equal to each other. Okay? The next properties we have are the associative properties. The associative properties. And they state we can group terms in any way. So for example, 6 plus 4 quantity plus 5 can equal the same thing as 6 plus quantity 4 plus 5. Now, the way that this changes our problem is according to our order of operations. We know that we are going to add what's in the parentheses first. So for instance, on this side of the equation, we're going to have 6 plus 4, which is 10, plus 5, which is going to be 15. On this side of the equation, we're going to be adding 4 plus 5 first, so that would be 9, plus 6, and that also equals 15, which means these two are still equal. So we can group them in any way. The same thing goes with the associative property of multiplication. All right, instead of adding, we have multiplying. So 6 times 4 quantity times 5. So we could write this as 6 times 4 times 5. All right. Which means 6 times 4 is 24. Oh, excuse me. Um, and then we would multiply that by 5, and 24 times 5 would be 120. All right, so we would have 120 on this side, and then 4 times 5 is 20 times 6, which would also be 120. All right, so that's the associative property. We have one more example here. Which expression is equivalent to quantity 2 plus 3 plus 6? In this case, you should know that it would be D. 2 plus quantity 3 plus 6. The numbers do not change. The signs do not change. All right, the only thing that changes is how we are grouping them. Okay. So the next properties we have are the identity properties. The identity properties. Now the identity properties are a little bit different for addition and multiplication. Where in the identity property of addition, we have 0 added to any number is the number itself. So for example, if I have 3 plus 0, all right, I'm adding 0 to a number, it's going to equal that number. All right? Whereas with the multiplication, 1 multiplied by any number gives the number itself. So in this case, we would do 3 times 1 equals 3. Okay? So in this case, you're adding 0. In this problem, you're multiplying 1. All right, and that's the identity property. All right, the next properties we have are the inverse properties. The inverse properties. And the inverse property of addition is when you negate the number and add to get 0. So basically what you're doing is um, you're adding the opposite. So instead of the inverse of 5 would be negative 5, and 5 plus negative 5 would equal 0. All right. In the inverse property of multiplication, you would flip the fraction and multiply to get 1. So the inverse of 5 is 1 over 5. So 5 times 1 over 5 would equal 1. So you are finding the inverse of the problems. In the addition, it would be the opposite. In the multiplication, it would be the reciprocal. Okay? All right. The last two properties we have before we go through and review these would be the multiplicative property of 0. And the multiplicative property of 0 states that for every real number n times 0 equals 0. So we could do negative 35 times 0 is going to equal 0. Okay? All right. And then the multiplicative property of negative 1 states that for every real number n, negative 1 times n is going to equal uh, negative n. So in this case, if I have negative 1 times 5, it's going to equal negative 5. All right, this is also true if we are multiplying negative 1 times another negative number times negative 5, okay? It would actually be 5 in this case. All right, but it's going to equal the negative version of that number. In this case, it would be negative 5, which would be positive 5. Okay. All right, so let's match up these problems. So we have all the properties here, including the distributive property, and we're going to match them real quick with the different terms. So the first one we have is distributive property. The distributive property is where you're distributing the outside number to the numbers within the parentheses. So if you look over here, if you guessed it was this one, you are correct. Okay. The identity property of multiplication. All right. The identity property of multiplication. Take a look. If you found it was this one, you are correct. Okay. The addition inverse property, the property of inverse property of addition. Okay, that would be this one. Okay, the commutative property. The commutative property. The commutative property would be this one. In this case, we're talking about multiplication. The multiplicative inverse would be 4 over 5 times 5 over 4, which would equal 1. The associative property would be this one. The identity property of addition, remember that's the one where you are adding 0. Okay. The multiplicative property of 0, where you're multiplying something times 0. And last but not least, the multiplicative property of negative 1. All right, that's everything you should know, need to know about the properties of real numbers.